Today's workshop is on firescaping, and we're going to talk about how we reduce our vulnerability. As with all the G3 workshops, we like to think of our the story of the workshop as a set of puzzle pieces. So today's puzzle pieces start with the watershed wise approach, of course. And then we're going to go into a little bit about the history of fire ecology, and then talk a little bit about how that has shifted over the years and how we are changing the balance to new practices in managing fire. We're going to talk about protecting structures, which, as you will find out, is really one of the most important things that we can do with our exterior expertise. Then we're going to talk about design considerations for the landscape, the big mulch debate, and I hope there will be much discussion about the mulch debate. And then we added a little section on the aftermath because with recent fires in Southern California, there have been some excellent resources that are just being published to help us kind of understand better what is happening during these conflagrations. So we will proceed with the watershed wise approach. I want everyone to remember that when we talk about landscaping, we are talking about finding a way to create a balanced watershed in our own property. And what is the balanced watershed? And really, why does that have anything to do with firescaping? And it has everything to do with firescaping. The balanced watershed is essentially we've created an area of land that is covered with plant material that has healthy living soil. When it rains or when there's any kind of precipitation, the plant material and the soil are able to intercept and absorb that material, that water. When it water is directed down, slowed down by the plant material, it's directed down to the ground. It will overflow on some of the areas of the ground, but it's going through vegetation. And where it's able to actually infiltrate and be pulled by gravity down into the soil profile, it fills up all the pores in the root zone of the plant. It hydrates the soil. When it is actually able to percolate down into a water table where that's available, it recharges our groundwater resources. And where it starts to move both underground and through the soil and overland into creeks, rivers, streams, and ultimately the ocean, it's being cleaned. And all along the way, because there's this vegetation, it's being slowed down. And that's really, really important because what is happening is, I've used the word before, a hydration of our landscape. And hydrated landscapes are landscapes that are less likely to burn. In the balanced watershed, when the sun comes out, a process called evapotranspiration begins to happen. And that's a combination of evaporation off of soil and also transpiration through the leaves of plants. And essentially, plants are managing the transfer of water from the soil up into the atmosphere. This is also a super important thing for fire issues, but for everything really, because something very, very cool happens when that water is transferred up into the atmosphere. The plant isn't just sending water vapor. It's also sending microbes, soil microbes, actually, that it places within that water vapor. And when the water vapor goes back up into the sky, those soil microbes are able to condense water at a lower altitude than any of the other particulates that are in the air. So lower than pollution or dust or pollen even. And this is really super important for us living in cities and living in areas that are, land-based areas, especially as you begin to move inland, because what's happening is the plants are actually creating the conditions for bringing cloud cover and gentle rain back to the earth. And this cycle is one that has been severely damaged by uh, the just the reality of the building, the way we build, the way we've destroyed vegetation, throughout the world. And it is an opportunity really for landscape designers, landscape people to reinvigorate this watershed approach in every single landscape that we have, reinvigorate this water cycle. Now, it almost goes without saying, but I'm going to take you through a little thought process about fire, and start really with these, these beautiful ecosystems, forests. They're absolutely essential to human life on the planet. Um, we really wouldn't be breathing. Um, Stream flow and actually air quality all depend on healthy forests. And the well-being of urban dwellers also largely depends on healthy forest ecosystems. I love this picture now, maybe more than ever, because it really shows how we urban dwellers, suburban dwellers, have become so intertwined with the forest ecosystem, even though we may consider ourselves to be quite removed from the forest. Um, in reality, when you look at the way we have developed land, we are quite immersed within the forest and really quite vulnerable as a result of that. So I think this is something for us all to think about. I used to think about myself living in the flats, very densely urban area with high-rise buildings. And I used to think, yeah, forest fires very far away until, I got an evacuation warning for a recent fire. And you realize, no, we are all connected to the forests. Grasslands are also super important. This is a picture of the largest intact prairie in Sandhill, Nebraska. Um, it's, a beautiful ecosystem, very complex ecosystem, and essential to our health and well-being. And everything in between forest and grassland also is incredibly important to us. Even this weird landscape that we see in desert, this is Joshua Tree National Monument, which did burn irreparably during the York Fire in 2021. So pretty much every ecosystem we have has vulnerability to fire. And even in extremely water-rich environments like the boreal forests of Canada are not immune from, devastating fire. Just the last couple of years, there have been terrible forest fires in those areas. Now, one thing that we want to make clear right up front is that firescaping, this term applied to landscape design that takes into consideration fire, really isn't something unique to design. It is just a component of landscape design. It's just a component of the watershed approach. It's not something other. And I think it's important for us to remember, because what often happens, and I'll show some pictures, but I'm foreshadowing here. What often happens is when we talk about firescaping and we use a lot of an old paradigm about it, we end up actually making a desiccated environment instead of a vibrant environment. So we remove plants, we put down rock, we make things very sparse. And as a result, we actually impact that water cycle that I talked about just a few slides ago, and really have an impact on the hydration of our landscapes. So rather than start to think about firescaping as something that is about removal or about making things more sparse, we're going to put it right into our design practice for abundance. The most important thing we can be thinking about, as with all watershed approach landscapes, is how do we build healthy living soil that acts like a sponge? We need to contour the land, and this means finding ways to capture and hold on to rainwater on our properties. There really shouldn't be any flat yards anymore. We need to find a way to plant with climate appropriate plants, and most importantly, our local native plants. In California, these are California native plants, but really in all environments, the natives are the most climate appropriate. And we need to manage the water that's in the green water zone of the earth, and that is the root zone of plants. Now, irrigation is essentially the way that in a environment where supplemental water is required, we manage the green water zone. And that's really all irrigation is about. It's about making sure that this root zone of plants is hydrated. But the concept of managing green water goes even beyond just irrigation. It includes making sure that, of course, that we're capturing rainwater, but that we're actually holding it in the soil when we've selected plants that are climate appropriate. We are actually managing the green water zone because those plants are adapted to the particular water cycles of our area. And we're also here thinking about densely planting. As you can see in this picture, it's not sparse planting, it's dense planting. And the reason for the density of planting and the emphasis on it is that every single plant is contributing to this root zone, contributing to the reconstruction of soil and turning it into a sponge. And so therefore, the more plant material we have, the more likely we are to have a root zone that can hold on to a really good quantity of water and keep things, keep the soil hydrated. Now, a lot of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about in the rest of this presentation come from some of the great resources that are out there. I'm going to highlight two of them that I think are particularly excellent. The book on Firescaping by Douglas Kent. I think it may even be in a third edition now, I don't know, but it's a wonderful, wonderful guide. And the Firescaping Your Home Guide by Adrienne Edwards and Rachel Schleiger. I'm not sure I pronounced their names correctly, but both of these books are really wonderful. They have a lot of step-by-step ideas, and some of their ideas are incorporated into this conversation. We're going to start with discussing community planning. So community planning is really one of the most essential things that we can be doing for fire resilience, for resilience of any kind, but especially for fire resilience. And every single person, you know, in a community is connected to the other people in the community through their landscapes, through their residences. I love this little picture because, we're focused in on a particular plot in it, but you can see immediately that there's no extraction of that plot from the rest of the community. It's really all of a piece. And so decisions that are made for this community require input and require input of experts. And this is a place that landscape professionals really can have a voice. One of the most important things for us to consider from a community perspective is how do we get into and out of our communities, especially in cases of fire and of other disasters. Having parking zones that close off the access roads is something that we really need to think about. Are there other ways for us to have parking maybe further away with some kind of shuttles or with walking areas? All of this is, I wouldn't want to be a fire truck. I wouldn't want to be in an ambulance trying to get out of this neighborhood when there are all these cars parked here, or if people were trying to all move at the same time. Here's an excellent example from Santa Barbara, where this is supposed to be a two-way traffic access road, and it clearly isn't. So these are things for communities now to start to really think about, and we've seen them in recent fires that this is a big deal. So really finding ways to plan for off-street parking is pretty critical. And that is something that's resisted in communities, but it's also resisted by property owners. They don't want to give up space for parking. Yet having that off-street parking could mean the difference between life or death if if fire engines and so forth, emergency vehicles have to have access to an area. So planning for off-street parking and really talking to clients about how they can do that and how they can promote it in their neighborhoods. And then, of course, managing roadside vegetation. So again, this is from the Santa Barbara area. And the reason that we pulled these pictures is because they predated pretty big fires that were happening in Santa Barbara. And this is really quite typical of developed communities, especially more upscale communities. The roads are narrow, and you have vegetation encroaching on the road itself. So this is supposedly for privacy, and of course it does create privacy from the road, and yet that could be something that is problematic for having access. Okay, well, let's start talking a little bit, or understanding really, a little bit more about the history of fire and what fire ecology is all about. So actually, in the watershed, there is a historic role for what I would call moderate fire, gentle fire. In fact, native communities were managing most of the North American woodlands quite well for, centuries, using fire as a tool for keeping uh, the ground cover open, being able to create more of a hunting environment. This image is from 1905. It's one of the earliest images of North American woodlands. And you can really see all this open space, the trees, because of the fire, the trees have been kind of limbed up, and you can see beneath them. There's plenty of grassland beneath and vegetation, but it's not a dense thicket. And this is a method that was successfully used throughout North America, as I say, for centuries. And that use of fire to clear out the brush is wonderful because it clears the forest floor for new growth. It's actually completely critical to grasslands. Grasslands have to have fire in order to halt the succession of woody plants. So grasslands, because they haven't experienced fire, actually, we are losing our grasslands. But that is a halting succession, keeping landscapes disturbed, not all the time, but on some regular cycle, so that the plant material that responds to that disturbance continues to be very forby, very, different types of grasses, very early succession plants. When it reaches waterways, fire can clear that overgrowth in waterways. And there's actually, in a gentle fire, some of that burned vegetative matter will actually create almost like a nutrient boost to the landscape. So it lays on top of the landscape, and it's essentially like, it's almost like a biochar that becomes available then to the new growth, the new microbial community that begins to grow under this gently burned landscape. So one of the things that we also need to think about is that when there is this management of the undergrowth, there's actually less intense burning that happens because the fuel has been controlled. So we're not getting an extinction event of soil biology. And the root zone is not as affected when the fires are not as intense. So this is part of why fire control was, or using fire to control undergrowth was a good strategy for so long. And of course, in Western areas, but actually across the country, many native plants are actually pyrophytes. And pyrophyte means that it's a fire lover. It's adapted to fire, or it may even require fire in order to spread its seed or to thrive. It may have some kind of endemic pests that are only removed if there's fire. And so there's a lot of synergy with a fire cycle. And in our Western states, in California in particular, ceanothus and other chaparral plants are absolutely fire adapted. Our giant sequoias, or actually all the sequoias, have bark that's resistant to it. And they actually need a more bare soil floor in order to germinate their seeds. There are plants in prairie ecosystems that do not bloom and do their thing unless there has been a fire. And then the plants themselves are able to synchronize their coming to seed, or blooming and coming to seed. And so this is a way for some of these plants to actually, they're totally adapted to fire, and it's a way for them to continue to survive. In 1910, there was is it 1910 or 1980? I actually can't see my screen here. So weird. I think it's 1910. Yeah. There was a cataclysmic, at least from their perspective, forest fire that kind of changed everything. In the Idaho and Montana forests, about 3 million acres, which, in today's context, it seems like, oh, well, that's not very much. But in this particular context, it was really a terrible fire, and more so because towns that had been built into the forest and around the forest, or with forest surrounding them, burned to the ground. And this intense fire really sparked, oh, what a terrible thing to say, began a movement to have zero fire tolerance. So there was a absolute pushback on the idea that fire could be a beneficial tool. And there's a lot of kind of politics and thinking about or diminishment of the importance of indigenous technology and indigenous thinking that helped this movement gain ground. And so the way things had been managed previously was, termed, kind of parochial and was dismissed, and a new, more modern approach emerged. And this was zero fire tolerance. And in 1945, we actually, by 1945, we actually begin to see a campaign that is meant to convince people that there is a wasteful and immoral ethos around fire, that forest fires are something that aren't just, they're not a natural phenomenon. They are something that have to be controlled. And if you are allowing a forest fire to happen, there is something, shameful about you. There's something immoral about you. And so the Smokey the Bear campaign while it was, wildly successful in reducing forest fire, also really had a kind of underlying uh, message, which was about this preservation of a resource, and again a dismissiveness of the many centuries of positive use of fire as a tool. And so we stopped natural fires from burning. And I want to mention that this is Temescal Canyon in early 2024, and a hike that I used to do up the canyon. And you can see, yeah, this is essentially what we permitted to happen because we weren't using natural fire anymore. And open space actually became overrun by invasive species that became very difficult to manage. These fire conditions of too much fuel actually are exacerbated by drought and by the drought and deluge cycle. In a time of deluge, a lot of fuel would grow up and then drought would follow, and that fuel would brown out, become desiccated, and the soil became desiccated and no longer had any hydration because the plant material wasn't thriving. So it's a absolute cycle of degradation that is happening as climate whiplash, takes effect. And then, of course, plants um, that are under stress are attacked by things like bark beetles and other pests. And I think it's important to realize that in the California national forests, there are 162 million trees that have been killed by drought and beetle, and that's just in California. I mean, there are so many other states with massive forests that are undergoing the same kinds of um, attack, really. And it's part of the cycle, the degradation cycle of drought and deluge that is caused by climate whiplash. So now the fires that we see are burning too intensely to be beneficial. And of course, we have increased our development into the wildland urban interface. And that means that communities are under even more pressure to manage fires and to keep them from burning structures. And there are lots of lawsuits against, negligent utilities, and negligent is in parentheses here because, um, part of the question um, about that, that utilities have is, well, we're delivering power to places that, um, you know, are in the wildland urban interface. And, is it demand or supply really that is at the root of the problem? And I personally don't have any comments about, I don't have any further, thought on that, but I imagine that is a thing for development and community management to really be thinking about. And then, of course, insurance companies, stopped writing policies in this wildland urban interface. And we're seeing fire insurance becoming not just more expensive, but unattainable. And not just in wildland urban interface, but in really many places that before were not considered to be wildland, are having difficulty getting fire insurance. And when you can get insurance, the management protocols in the residential or in the urban space have become, really draconian. I mean, they've just become so prescriptive and so far away from the watershed approach to landscaping. And on the state side, on the management of the public lands, it's just become, it's become untenable. I mean, these prices are from 2000 and 2023. And at that time, an acre of thinning in the wildlands was about $1,500 an acre. We've got millions, tens of millions of acres. And then getting permits to actually, do work in these areas has become quite expensive. So yeah, and we have 20 million acres as a state that need to be managed. So, it's just something that we can't continue to fund publicly, at these kinds of rates. So that's a real pressure and a real issue. And then when we talk about resilience and how it applies into places where people are living, we find that, and it's not surprising because it really is pretty much like all services and landscaping and so forth. But demographics actually really affect the funding that goes into various communities for wildfire resilience. And so counties with the highest wildfire risks actually have the highest number of people with disabilities and the highest number of families in poverty and with difficulty speaking English, and places that don't have a car, and all, begin to think about all the things that as a community, put people at risk, and with saving lives being really probably the primary objective of fire management. It's something for us to really think about in terms of uh, community design. And it really comes back to this community design and thinking about how do we manage our thinking more like communities. So that's the history. We can actually change the balance. The balance is changing. And how is that happening? Well, first, one of the solutions that we need to start considering even more is outright rethinking development. It doesn't make sense anymore to have development in the intermix. So intermix is where development is found within the wildland urban, the wildland urban interface is actually surrounding the development. It means that we are building into these wildlands instead of keeping them separate from the development areas. Regenerative land management, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is also a really critical solution for managing fire on a community level. Having animals and so forth on the land, there need to be just millions and millions more animals on our wildlands. And then, of course, controlled burning, which we're hearing more and more about, thankfully. And this is really getting back to a lot of indigenous knowledge and thinking about how we can manage fire with fire. In 1998, Florida actually amended their state laws to promote prescribed burns. And, this is something that on the face of it, you would think that doesn't seem very, that seems, kind of surprising for a lot of reasons. Isn't Florida kind of just a flat, wet state? And I mean, that's what comes to mind with me. And maybe the politics are, at the time are more conservative. I mean, it just doesn't seem like this would be one of the first states to start promoting prescribed burns. But because they have a population density that is right abutting these wild lands that they do desire to preserve, there is more emphasis on interagency cooperation. And so they are actually getting synergy between agencies in order to think about community resilience on a lot of different levels, not just hurricanes and those kinds of disasters, but also fire disasters, which could diminish their green infrastructure, which is so important to managing the other kinds of disasters that they face. So Oh, wrong direction. There we go. And this is an example of what it looked like in some of the Florida forests after controlled burn. The underbrush is gone. The trees are unscathed. They continue to be there. And a lot of that, yeah, undergrowth is managed and now will regenerate. So another solution is, finding more funding for projects. Of course, this is a never-ending transition, between federal administrations about how money for infrastructure is going to be allocated. In 2020, there was not 2020, but between 2020 and 2024, there was quite a lot of money being directed toward ecosystem recovery and reducing the risk of wildland fire. And there were grant programs set up, and we will see what happens with that in the future. Hopefully, that continues to be funded. Investing in communities is also super important. It's a solution to fire management. There are wildfire defense grants from many states, as well as federal money. And these are really focused on creating community groups, community defense groups that meet and make plans and actually even create opportunities for workforce development, for putting local people to work, making community, their own community more fire resilient. And there's a lot of emphasis on underserved populations, which, as we talked about earlier, there's a correlation between where the underserved populations are and where the high fire risk areas are. So that is, that ends up being a good investment all around. And then, of course, a solution is found in landscape and home design. And I love this picture. I've been looking at this picture for many years. And uh, and yet there are a couple things that come up for me when I think about landscape design and I think about this picture. I mean, seemingly, and this is from San Diego County in California. Seemingly the wildfire was really, stopped in its tracks at the landscaping of this home. What are the elements of that landscaping that contribute to this being, more fire resilient? And some of the things that come to mind here are, well, it's well irrigated. So this is a well irrigated area. There's lawn, which is, routinely irrigated plant. There are shrub fire breaks. So the shrubs are actually arranged to be a green fire break. I think it's very interesting that there are so many large shrubs and trees that are near the house. So I am interested in that. I see that there is hardscape or some kind of gravel area in the zero zone, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But there are also trees and shrubs that come up pretty darn close to this house. There's a wooden deck in this house. So I think it's very interesting, to kind of step back. This picture is used a lot as an example of fire safe landscaping. And yet there are elements of it that really aren't replicable. Or maybe there are other factors, that came into play for keeping this home safe during a conflagration. And this is really going to go to a difference between what we have in a dense urban area and an area that is not as dense. And in the past, we kind of talked about wildland interface as being distinct from an urban area, and that urban areas would be safer because they didn't have all this vegetation around them. And what we're finding out now is actually that's just not the case, that there is a continuum from wildland to what is, a very dense urban setting. And that actually, when we start getting into a more density the fire risk goes up because of the proliferation of embers and the way that we build our houses. So I'm just going to go back to this picture that we had before. The one thing that we can see here is that this is not a dense urban neighborhood, even though, it's in the wildland interface, but it's definitely not a dense urban neighborhood. There is land to plant, grass and fire breaks and that kind of stuff. When we get into a really urban setting, we don't have as much space to do that kind of work. So this is something for us to start to think about. And actually, this image was excerpted from a new draft of a urban forest manual by CAL FIRE, and we'll provide that as a resource and talk about it a little bit more in just a bit. So let's take a little divergence down this protecting structures road and kind of get out of the way the things that we can do on the exterior of buildings to really help to reduce the fire, the fire risk. And in order to have this conversation, we have to distinguish between steps that we are going to take to create a defensible space. And defensible space means this is a space where a firefighter can come and take a stand. They can actually defend that site. It is, the landscaping, the home is going to be, saved, and I say that in quotes. It's not going to be a loss. Then we have survivable, and survivable is thinking about what would happen if firefighters can't get to this area. What are we going to do to, make it so that if firefighters aren't there, we might still have a structure, or we might still have a landscape. You know, these are two very different things, and we need to think about them both in our design. So California state law actually has firescaping built into it for development. And this is, there are a couple of key things, and we're going to come back to it, and I'm going to talk about some of these things in, more detail. But the thing that the California law is basically establishing is these zones. So different plant material, different strategies for reducing embers, for reducing fire occur in each of these zones. And the most important zone that was established here is the 0 to 5, or the zero zone. And this is 0 feet from the foundation out 5 feet from the house. Number one zone where embers are going to be an issue, and really something that we all should be thinking about. And then beyond that, we have the 5 foot to 30 foot zone, and then from 30 feet beyond out to 100 feet. So 100 feet away from a building is all space that needs to be thought about. If you're in an urban setting, your distance between you and your neighbor could only be 10 feet. So there's a lot more house hardening that has to happen in an urban setting. And this is because 60 to 90% of homes are actually burned due to embers. Embers are the key thing. And so structures have to be designed to stop those firebrands, which is another word for embers. And the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety does some amazing work, and I am actually going to share with you some of their work. Oops. Sorry, I know I have to do the So what we're seeing here is a a video that you can watch in greater detail. But this is a video done by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, where they are blasting a home with embers inside a controlled, a controlled environment, and they are mapping what is happening in that controlled environment. And I just want to go back here 1 second and show you. So you can see these embers are being blasted, and this is really interesting right here. Oops. So can you see that the embers have taken hold at the base of the house and in this 0 to 5 zone? The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is what's going on here. So you can see here that there's the house, there's a little stoop here that comes out, and then this is like an enclosed landscape area. And we can have a conversation about what's going on in this enclosed landscape area, because it's frankly highly unrealistic from what would be going on in an actual landscape. But let's put that aside for a second. You will notice that the embers are gathering, at the bases of these structures, and especially here where the house had a facade that came across like that, and then this little bump out, and it creates a 90-degree angle or an angle here. This is the place that a lot of embers are able to gather, and it is one of the most vulnerable spots in your landscape. And I will tell you that in the past, as a landscape designer, I would, I would be putting something here, right, to frame, or even something like this, so that when the people are looking out their windows, they're looking at something. And especially in these little nooks, to because how often do we see the valves, right here at the entrance to the house? And so we want to cover that up, and we want to make this more welcoming. So on either side of the door, there might be, some kind of welcoming that's happening here, even if it's a container, with plants in it or something like that. And if it was, a little bit wider, let's say, I might even have put like a water feature here for birds, so that you could see it coming into the house, so you can see it looking out the window here. And what I now realize is that it was absolutely wrong, because what I was really doing was putting plant material right in the direction of where, fire would be the most, where it would be most vulnerable to fire. So you can see here what's happening. And then you can see that once those embers take hold, the fire is going up into the ignites the exterior of the building, goes up into the eaves. Embers may even blow up into the eaves, into the roof. And this is how things get out of control. So let's go back to just a second. I'm toggling. I've never been very good at this, but if you will bear with me. Actually, let me just see what I need to do here. There we go. That's what I need to do. Okay. All right, we're back on track now. Okay, so I highly recommend that you take a little trip through the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. They have a bunch of different videos like the one I just showed you. And you really can get a better understanding of what's going on. In terms of roofs, which, as an exterior designer, I was many times asked about roof material. And it needs to be, these more vulnerable materials need to be replaced with Class A rated materials. And in the last fires that happened in Southern California, most of the roof materials were asphalt shingles, something like 46%, I think. And we'll cite the actual paper at the end. But really a vast majority of the roof material is asphalt shingles. And so despite the fact that they can be fire rated, that might have been an issue. These other more fire resistant roofing materials are really preferred in fire zones. And I want to mention that metal or standing seam roof, even though possibly one of the most expensive types of roofing that you could do, also has advantages for rainwater capture. So if we're ever going to be drinking rainwater, you're going to want a metal roof to capture it on. But all of these options are fire rated for resistance to fire. And that's fire rating is really essentially placing materials on a continuum for how long it takes for them to fail when there's fire. So these are good alternatives. Something that you can absolutely recommend in every single landscape that you work on is take a look at the eaves of the building and recommend that they close in the eaves if they are not already closed in. And so creating this enclosure, it reduces all the possibilities of where those embers could gather. You saw those right angles, are a perfect place for the eaves to be more vulnerable to embers gathering there. So close them off and put in vents. Make sure that if you have gutters, there are gutter guards installed. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is the drip guide under the roof. So this is an asphalt shingle roof, and there's a drip guide that's underneath it, a metal flashing really. The water drips off the bottom of this guide into the roof. I mean, into the gutter. I cannot tell you how many roofs I've seen, especially ones that have been refinished, 2 or 3 times in their lifetime, where these drip guides are not properly installed, and in some cases cut because somebody has an aesthetic. They don't want to see, the drip guide coming out from under the roof. And that these are all things that are keeping embers from getting up into the roof, from getting into the gutters. So you want to have them installed properly. Vents need to be covered. Not just with this kind of venting that you see here, but which these wood slats, which or might even be metal, but I think it's wood. One thing here is the eaves are boxed. That's great, but the vent is open, and so the vent needs to be covered with 1/8 inch or smaller metal screens, not coated plastic, not metal that has been coated, but actual metal screens. And these are available at pretty much every, hardware store known. So yeah, do that. Why? Because you don't want the embers getting into the attic or into the crawl space at the top of the building and burning the house from the top down. Siding. Make sure you're only using Class A rated siding. There are really, the vinyl siding, actually, really take a very close look at vinyl. It's listed here because it is listed as Class A. But, definitely take a look at that, because vinyl siding, I'm always seeing pictures of things. It's probably just the images, but vinyl siding melting. So, but fiber cement, good alternative. Thinking about having stone or brick veneer, making sure that there is something that is resisting, burning. If there were one investment to make in a home that you could recommend as a landscape person, it is that the property owner install double pane tempered glass windows. This is this is absolutely a life-saving measure. Um, and it also has so many benefits for energy savings, etc., sound, all that stuff. But from a fire perspective, as we're going to talk about in just a little bit, radiant heat is one of the three key reasons that houses catch fire. And also, if there is a fire that is burning, let's say some vegetation near a window, these windows are able to resist that temperature and won't blow out and won't burn. And when you think about what is inside, just inside of a window, there are curtains, there's furniture, there's a rug, there could be wood floors. Um, all of that stuff is going to absolutely, just ignite almost instantaneously if embers get inside. So if a window blows out, that fire is going to be inside in a moment. And once it's inside, it's almost unstoppable. Consider installing exterior building sprinkler systems. These have gained, a lot of popularity since recent fires in Southern California. And the jury is still out on whether or not they are, worth the investment. But certainly it's something to consider, something to price out. Frankly, I look at this picture and I see, all this vegetation essentially touching the house and think, yeah, and and even on the bottom right-hand corner, I see vegetation under the eaves of the building. And I'm thinking, yeah, I think there are other measures you could do that would be as cost effective, but it's certainly something to consider. Now, this is something I want to draw your attention to. We've talked quite a lot about embers. I showed you that video. 60 to 90% of structure ignition is coming from embers gathering at the base of the house, blowing into, vents, burning under windows, under doors, to get inside the house. Embers are a big deal. But we also have two other considerations. The second one is continuity of fuels. And so this is when there's a direct flame contact. There's a wood structure like a deck or a fence that comes right into the home and directs the fire right up to the structure. And then we also have density of structures. And this is the radiant heat issue. So is there a shed? Is there an ADU? Is there a neighbor, right next to you where you've built to the lot line? And the those outlying buildings catch fire, and especially when the wind is coming from the direction of those particular structures, that heat is blown onto your structure and ignition happens. So this is one of the reasons why having those windows, the tempered glass dual pane windows, is super important, because it can help you resist this radiant heat. We'll talk about this continuity of fuels and density of structures in a second. So one thing we do want to be thinking about is how do we reduce the fuel that is available, especially if we're on hillsides. Try to find ways to interrupt the fire path, either with walls with material that doesn't burn, or even with plant material that could potentially create a fire break. Making sure that no wood is stored next to or under the house or decks. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. Decks should absolutely be properly sited. They should be steel framed. If we're building decks now, we need, I know it's 5 times the cost of a wood frame construction, but steel construction is going to make all the difference. And then thinking about what's happening underneath the deck. So making sure that there's a hardscape under there of some kind. It can be permeable, like a gravel, but also making sure there's no vegetation growing underneath. And having some kind of a patio under there is really important. And then on top of the deck, making sure that the material that is the decking itself is fire resistant. So either a hardwood like an epay or some other hardwood, making sure that the fasteners are metal and it's very tight. There are no gaps between the boards. Um, it's maybe tongue and groove. This is important because if embers get up underneath and they blow up through those gaps, they could start a fire on top of the deck. Making sure that the underside of the deck has had a fire resistant material applied to it, some sort of flame retardant put on the underside of the deck. This is how you keep these things from burning. And really thinking a lot more carefully about any structures that are attached to the residence and go out into the landscape in some way. So for example, patio covers, really having ignition resistant materials, again, increases the cost maybe 5 times. And, who knows with supply chains, how much that's going to increase, but certainly having fire resistant materials is critical, metals preferred, really no fabrics. It really it really is terrible for that whole romantic look, but it's just reality. No plastic materials, making sure that the finish on this is powder coated, or if it has to be painted, that it's a solid body stain, not something that can peel. And making sure that we are eliminating wood steps that attached to the building, or fences, even railings attached to the building. So really looking now to use more metal fencing and railings and so forth being made out of metal, and making sure that we have wide enough gates. So instead of, little walk gates that we see all the time, very charming, we want to make sure that we have 4-foot gates so that things can open up, so that equipment and people can pass through those gates. One thing I really want to emphasize, and I don't know if I have it. No, I don't really. I want to just talk about this, having worked in places that have now burned, that are wildland interfaces, more upscale communities. I used to find property owners who would say, okay, I want my yard enclosed. And so we've discussed all kinds of fencing material, and they of course want it to be as high as possible. And I would recommend that there would be gates, and that we would have a gate on either side, at least 2 gates through the fencing. And there was always pushback on this. And it's because the thinking was, I want privacy, I want to be secluded, I don't want any access, not so much access from my neighbors, but from, somebody who might try to get through that gate, and harm my property or my family. And so this safety issue was framed as excluding the outside world was the most important thing. Well, especially if you live in a fire zone, it's actually, you want to include the outside world. And the reason is, you may be in a position where the only way out of your property is through your backyard. You want a gate to be able to get out through your backyard. And oh, by the way, you want your neighbor to be able to get out. So having not just one gate, but one on either side is really an important thing, in making sure they're wide enough. Using materials like cast concrete or cement board with steel posts and fencing. This picture, it's not a very good picture, but this is a cement board, and the fence that's right in front of you, it looks like wood, but it's actually a cement board that's been solid body stained. And then on the right-hand side is a cast concrete wall fence. And so these are fire resistant materials. And notice the eaves are boxed in. So cement board on steel fencing posts is a wonderful underutilized material. This is the same material that can be used as siding on houses, as a Class A rated siding. It's relatively inexpensive. There are some things that you have to think about. You know, it needs to be pre-drilled and so forth. Um, but it with a little bit of reinforcement, it takes it takes a solid body stain, a little bit of reinforcement. It's quite sturdy, and it comes with a wood grain on it if you like that, or just plain if you don't. And so it's great material. Weld mesh, oh, weld wire mesh or chain link fencing is also good. Gosh, if you had said chain link fencing to me 10 years ago, I would have rolled my eyes and gone away from a design perspective. But guess what? In a fire zone, it's actually better than wood fencing. Welded wire mesh can be extremely attractive, and you can pretty much get um, any kind of pattern that you want. It can be either stainless steel or galvanized dipped 9-gauge welded mesh. Hot dipped, so zinc coated basically, or powder coated. Not painted if you can. If it is being painted, it's being painted with a paint that is, like a flat paint that's not going to peel. 2-inch openings or less is good, and no privacy slats on it, because those are usually plastic or wood and they burn. Make sure when you're designing and thinking about it, you're increasing firefighter accessibility. Again, this is the multiple pedestrian gates, between your neighbors, and making sure that they're wide enough. I want to take a look at this installation because it has a lot of features that are great, and maybe some things that aren't so good. But what we see here is, we have a tree on the property that has been limbed up. We have it's deciduous right now, but you can see it's limbed up a third of its height. B, we have a metal fence that is on the periphery. C is a wall that is a potential fire break on the wall. D, stairs that are decomposed granite that are, wide enough that have really good access. They're not too steep, and they're made out of material that is fire rated. The permeable surfaces, G is another fence, another potential fire break fence. E is plant material that has been spaced out, for its proper growth, but there's a lot of it. It's not a very sparse planting. It's actually, I mean, this is a new planting, but it's not very sparse. And then F, there is a mulch down, but it's a very small mulch that's going to decompose. So, when we look at a picture like this is actually, for a hillside property, this is actually a pretty good fire scaping example. Okay, let's go into landscape design, because obviously that's important to us. So what does stoke a fire? Well, fuel, that's a big one, having something to burn. And dry wind and topography. So topography is actually really important. The fire moves up a hill a lot faster, and the reason for that is that hot air rises. And so as that hot air, and in fact almost a wind, is created from the fire itself, it dries out all the plant material. Anything that is in front of that fire gets really dry really fast, and so then the fire is almost pulled up the hill by this heat drying things out and creating more fuel as it goes. So it can really move up a hill quite quickly. So being in a hilly fire zone is even more dangerous than not. We're going to discuss 3 fuel modification zones, which we mentioned before. There's zone 0, which is that zone between 0 and 5 feet. And then what we're going to sort of call zone 1 extends out a little bit beyond that, out to maybe 10 feet. Um, uh, I'm sorry, the zone 1 is 5 to 30 feet, and then beyond that is 30 to 100 feet. And 100 feet away from a building is kind of the limit of the fuel modification directives. But of course, we're thinking about all of the vegetation that is on our property, and also whether or not we're at the top or the bottom of a slope. So if we have a slope, we obviously want to have a good sense of how steep it is, which we can absolutely measure. And I don't think I have to go into that with professionals. But we do also want to be thinking about how we space plants on a hillside to be more fire resistant. And so spacing actually ends up being quite important. And this isn't so much spacing about ground covers and stuff, but really more about spacing for shrubs and trees, making sure that as that slope becomes more steeper, the distance between the plants becomes greater. So what you see here is that on a flat plane, if you're planting trees, you're going to want to make sure that you have at least 10 feet between the mature canopy edge or drip line of the tree. So 10 feet between the canopies of the trees, and that's at maturity. For shrubs, you want to have at least 2 times the height or the average height of the shrubs distance between the each of the shrubs. So that's on a flat or very, very mild slope. As the slope becomes steeper, and if we look at the steepest here, which is like a 40% or greater slope, you can see that you want to have at least 30 feet between what would be the canopies or the drip lines of the trees, and you want to have 6 times the height of the shrubs between the shrubs on the slope. So this spacing is really something to keep in mind as you're laying out your planting plans. We definitely want to avoid fire ladders. Fire ladders are all about managing that fuel connectivity, keeping the shrubs out of the canopies, smaller shrubs out of the canopies of the larger shrubs, out of the canopy of the trees. And in order to do that, we are essentially limbing up woody shrubs that are larger. I'm thinking things like toyons and so forth. We are limbing up trees so that their canopy is now a third of the height of the tree, at a minimum. And keeping this distance really between the plant material. Now, this does not mean that the plant material cannot be dense. It just means that there has to be a separation so that if a fire comes in, especially in that 5 to 30 zone, if a fire comes in and ignites a small shrub, it doesn't have a ladder to get up into the canopy of a nearby tree. And that's really something that needs to be managed on, an annual basis at the very least. From 0 to 5 feet, we want no combustibles. Now you're going to say, well, wait a second, I see plant material here and firefighters say there should be no plant material. There is a reactionary response that says, yeah, this should all be gravel or some other, hardscape of some kind. And personally, I think the 0 to 5 zone creates an opportunity for a walking area around the house. It actually gives you an opportunity to manage things like vents that are very close to the grade or drip screeds that are coming out of the base of stucco installations. It allows you to really manage what's going on around your doorways, making sure there are no gaps and so forth. Because remember, this is where embers are going to gather. But this picture is really wonderful. It's a wonderful designer, is actually one of the founders of G3 and taken many, many years ago. But you can see here that the yarrow and so forth is, pretty well managed here, and it's green. It's well irrigated. It's not desiccated material. Embers would not take hold here because they would be coming into vegetation that is, not really combustible. So there is, and every fire department kind of has a different interpretation of this. Um, but having some very low growing ground cover that is well irrigated, could be just as viable as having it all be hardscape. And making sure that tree skirts have been lifted. It says a minimum of 6 feet, and that's really thinking about like woody shrubs, up to a third of the total height of the tree. So think about it. If you have a eucalyptus that's a 100-foot tree, that means the first 30 feet are going to have the limbs removed. The skirts are going to be lifted up. That is going to have implications for privacy and so forth. And so this really means we need to be thinking about how we are designing these landscapes and how we're installing these landscapes to maintain privacy, but making sure that we're getting rid of that wood. Non-combustible permeable pathways are really important. Decomposed granite is one. I've always loved this picture, but as I keep looking at it more and more, I do see, like, it's interesting. Like right here on the right-hand side is this wall that has the 90-degree angle, and right there, is a shrub. And so it would be something to think about whether that is the right place for a shrub or if it should just be really ground cover. You really start to look at designs with new eyes when you start thinking about fire safety. But it doesn't have to look like this. And that's really the most important thing. In fact, this is the worst thing we could be doing. We want to make sure that we have stone or concrete permeable walkways, that we have a lot of permeable material in the early zone. So the 0 to 5, the 5 to 30, we're thinking about that. And this is a place where a judicious use of rock is perfectly fine, as long as it's kept as a permeable material. And of course, low ground cover. This is all irrigated ground cover, very low growing, very low water requiring. It's, it's going to stop embers, not enhance them. It's also a great place to capture and hold on to rain. And when we do hold on to rain, holding it in the soil is the best bet. We could also install a backup water supply with a solar pump. So this is actually, something to seriously consider if you have the space. Having a cistern for backup water supply, especially an above ground cistern. And of course, consider having a natural lawn. So this is basically converting your lawn into something that is no longer a monoculture so that it's more resilient. Unfortunately, the fire recommendations have it maintained at a maximum 4-inch height. The good news is that for most natural lawns, that is the minimum height. So 4 inches, is still within the reasonable fire break for the natural lawn, and you certainly could do that very easily. But there are also other low water need plants that work beautifully in the 0 zone or in the 0 and 1 zones. Some of them include like these sedums and echeverias, ground covers like the wild strawberry or the erigeron seaside daisy. These are all low growing options that, especially with the proper irrigation, are going to resist fire. And making sure that if your winter or your summer, depending on where you are in the country, for Western states, might be more about winter dryness. So making sure that there is regular irrigation in winter dryness in places that are cold, that the irrigation's turned off, making sure that there is sufficient irrigation in the spring and summertime. And really, making sure that the zones 0 and 1 are well hydrated, that the plants are well hydrated and soil moisture is maintained. So that 5 to 30 zone, so the sort of the zone 1, we want to make sure that vegetation is managed, that grasses are cut down annually, trees are limbed up, there's no space between shrubs. We can still use a little bit of rock in this place. Having, a lush landscape is really where it's at. And this is the perfect place to make sure that we are contouring and capturing rainwater. Putting in fire breaks that are like low stone or riprap walls are super valuable. Even gabion walls are a good option, although gabion walls do have these little crevices for embers, especially if they're not too planted, they can still resist the fire. Having decorative recycled concrete is a good fire break in these areas. And of course, keeping your stone outcroppings where they are, where they are, instead of trying to, change your landscape to get rid of these things. Like, who would get rid of that? But I've seen it. Planting in beds with pathways between is a really great strategy. So essentially, instead of thinking about, let's say, a backyard in that 5 to 30 zone as just one giant planter, making pathways that go through it, permeable pathways, and breaking up the planting areas so that these pathways essentially become fire breaks. So and making sure they're generous pathways, not just narrow things, but really 3, even better, 5-foot wide pathways. 2 people can walk side by side. And especially if you have the space to do it, great opportunity. And thinking about on hillsides, what are some plants that, even though some of them might be pyrophytes, they have good erosion management capability. They can stand up to fire. They regenerate if there is a fire. So things like ceanothus and toyon are wonderful in that space. The eriogonum as a ground cover is terrific in more hillside or erosion area. Then celias are also great, lots of deep roots and so forth. In the 5 to 30 zone, drip irrigation is probably best. I want to keep in mind, everybody, that if a fire does come through, your irrigation is going to be, once it gets to the property, the irrigation is gone. Any plastic pipe that's, 6 inches below the surface is probably going to be melted. Any emitters are melted. Certainly drip irrigation that just sits under the mulch is going to be melted. So, but in terms of keeping things hydrated, drip irrigation is the best. In that 30 to 100 zone, we're looking for no dead vegetation, good spacing at maturity, basic maintenance. And thinking about removing flammable trees and shrubs. Now, there's a lot of new information about this. I want to draw your attention to the palms and pine. Palms in particular, if they are not maintained so that their seeds in particular and the really dead branches are allowed, or dead fronds are allowed to stay on the trees. It's too bad because that's all, kind of good habitat stuff. But that is what creates a lot of embers if they do catch fire. So it's something to consider if you're in an area where embers can be coming through. The palms, could become just torches. And pine is very interesting because you can limit up, but if you allow the pine needles to gather at the base of the pine, it has been shown that pine needles can be viable fuel 15 years after they fall because there's not sufficient decomposition. So if you have pine needles, a lot of pine trees, this is probably a thing that you are going to want to manage by raking it up. It's one of the few times that we're going to talk about actually eliminating leaf litter, but raking it up and running it through a compost pile so that it can turn into something that's beginning to decompose or has already decomposed and then come back out under the landscape. It's just unfortunate, but pine needles in and of themselves without green material will not decompose very quickly and do pose a real fire hazard. Of course, other things here, bamboo, eucalyptus, juniper, cypress, they all have properties that can make them fire hazards. I mean, all this dead material, especially that grows on the inside of things like cypresses and junipers, That's all, really flammable. And so it's something to think about in the placement of them. Is it the right thing? And even if they're well irrigated, all that dead stuff is just really part of the way they grow. With regard to bamboo, limbed up is better. Of course, they drop a huge amount of leaf litter. So that leaf litter really needs to be processed through a compost bin in order to not be an ember hazard. And, Italian cypress, frankly, isn't very romantic in a fire zone, as beautiful as it is in the Mediterranean climate. Uh, you know, yeah, all that dead material on the inside is just difficult. And clearly, these people did not get the fire safe memo, right? Pretty much everything about this is, yeah, right. So think about your tree selection and placement. You might have to remove some trees that are not placed properly within your landscape. It's just a very sad reality. But that doesn't mean you get rid of all your trees, and it doesn't mean that all trees are bad. It just means think about some of your options. Look for more local native trees. In the West, the live oaks and sycamores, arbutuses. These are, which isn't necessarily a native, although it could be crossed with a native. But these are trees that are better for situations. And consider installing a redundant spray rotor irrigation system. So you can wet down a property in advance of a fire. So let's take a look at another garden design. Quick garden design. This is a hillside property. What's going on here? Well, we have a bunch of things. We have boxed-in eaves, which you can see with the in E, at least the eaves are boxed in. The structure is a wood structure, so that's a bit of an issue. And you can even see that the paint is peeling on it. So that's a very vulnerable structure because that's connected right into the property and would conduct fire, right off the hillside. Structure is actually covered in plant material, which would conduct the overhead structure rather, which would conduct the fire up into it. There is a good hardscape material on the ground, so that's not very flammable. That's F, but G has plastic furniture, and plastic furniture would be something that would burn, very quickly. We have stairs here, but they're fairly narrow stairs. So it's not going to be easy for firefighters to get through there. The tree canopy, the B tree canopy, is overhanging the structure, and again, quite romantic, but really a hazard. D shows that we have a metal fence up there, so that's probably pretty good. So this is a mixed bag, but maybe your eye is getting even better in looking at things now through a fire lens. All right, so let's have a moment for the big mulch debate and really start with the basics. Keeping that soil sponge going and improving soil moisture is absolutely the most critical thing for plant health, and it's the most critical thing for fire safety. Making sure that soil is well hydrated in winter in the Mediterranean climates and well hydrated in the spring into the summer in the as you move more inland. Choosing not to have invasive plants. In California, we have a invasive plant list at Cal IPC, and I'm sure other states have similar kinds of lists. Things like the grasses and especially these two grasses that you see here are very typical ornamental plants in urban areas, and they are absolute escapees. They get out into the wildlands, they are fire conductors. So making sure that we're thinking about what we're planting in the landscape. Mulches, absolutely avoiding combustible mulches. I'm going to start with the rubber mulch, which is absolutely explosive. This is a petroleum product, so the rubber mulch is going to explode. You not just conduct fire, but make it a lot worse. Gorilla hair and walk-on bark are two examples of mulch you see in a lot of landscapes. Gorilla hair used to be, a much recommended type of mulch. And yet what's going on with that is we're not getting decomposition with that material. And really the key to soil health is decomposition of any vegetative matter that lies on top. So your walk-on bark is just too big to decompose. The gorilla hair with the shreds, that doesn't decompose. Both of these are excellent places for embers to, stay and, and even, smolder for a very long period of time. Dyed mulch is actually treated with materials that can be highly combustible, and doesn't decompose. It's treated with, the dye is often inhibiting microbial decomposition. And so these are all examples of something that you don't want in your landscape. Please avoid them. Instead, select green-brown mulches. And so these are mulches that have a little bit of leaf litter in them, a little bit of twigs and so forth in it, smaller than 1.5 inches. So they're small material. Why? We want it to decompose. Keep it at 3 inches thick. There's a lot of discussion about this. I hope you're asking questions and talking amongst yourselves back there in the Q&A section, because this is really, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the fire fighting community about the role of mulch and the soil moisture boost and the plant moisture boost that comes from a cool surface that is holding on to lots of water is just incomparable to really any other strategy for eliminating embers igniting. Composted material is always better than nuggets. And fresh trimmings are probably the best option because they're wet. There's a, when there is a good wet mulch or a good decomposable mulch, I'll say, so not one of the larger pieces, but something that is actually decomposing, the temperature of the mulch itself can get to 600 degrees above ground, but below ground, beneath that mulch, there's only 100 to 200 degrees. Now that is, when you get much above 100 degrees, you are, you're inhibiting the soil microbial community, but you are not burning things beyond repair. So this is, this is kind of an important thing to be thinking about, keeping the mulch diverse with the green and the brown, and also continually replacing it if it's needed. So keeping the soil surface covered, removing debris from the roof, gutters, bases of walls. How many times have we seen it, especially during a windy, like a Santa Ana event? Leaves get blown up into the base of the walls. Perfect place for embers to take hold. Avoid gasoline-powered equipment. Several years ago, there was a fire started nearby by commercial landscaping working on a hill with gas-powered equipment. It took one spark and, the hillside went up. So it's something to think about. Unfortunately, the mowing height that is recommended is 4 inches as the maximum for lawn, and lawn is really healthiest between 4 and 7 inches. So, but it is a reminder that keeping lawn at 4 inches is a good strategy because you can still get the benefits of that longer plant material for the water conservation that it provides, and you're also complying with the fire break moist landscape. Every time you cut lawn or cut grass, cut any plant for that matter, but especially grass, you are making that plant convert its energy into regrowth of its canopy rather than regrowth of its roots. And root growth, root density is really what we're going after for building that soil health. So we want to, keep it at 4 inches. Using animals to clear vegetation is, probably one of the most underrated strategies that we have. Really, there should be millions and millions of animals out there on our native lands, clearing vegetation and restoring soils in these desiccated grassland, rangeland areas. Here's a great example. Before the goats have been left in, this is the kind of density we see. And then after the goats have been there, you get your limbed up, plants, you get the clearance underneath. It's almost like magic, and it's been fertilized. Okay, when you see a fire on the horizon, be aware, get your redundant irrigation up and running, get some water on the property, and we can have a discussion about whether that takes away pressure from the firefighting. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that. It's a legitimate concern. This is a great reason to have a cistern, so you're pumping the water out of the cistern into the landscape. Turn off your gas lines indoors and out. Before you leave all the gates open for firefighters. And then finally, in the aftermath, what do we do now? I mean, look, it's really got all this burned material. There are two great pieces of research out and more coming, pretty much every day. Two that I want to draw your attention to, this draft manual 2025 LA County wildfires. These are field observations from the two major Southern California fires and you can see the date here is March 6th. It's a wonderful assessment of risk of landscaping. And you know what? It all mostly comes down to hardening the house, frankly. And then post-fire restoration. This is it's another draft publication that has really good advice in it. One thing to think about is after fire, if you have landscaping that has been impacted by the fire, the most important thing is to not do anything, frankly. Take a beat. You definitely don't want to remove anything. You don't want to prune anything. You don't want to be fertilizing. You don't want to be running vehicles, across the root zones of any of these, trees or large shrubs that might compact the soil further. Keep in mind that microbial activity has really been impacted, which means that you're going to lose your sponginess in your soil. And the more compacted it gets, the more vulnerable it is to erosion. And if it's followed by rainstorms, this could be a real disaster. So really do not disturb as much as possible. But please do step back, assess, look at things, inspect things, hire professionals for your trees. ISA certified arborists, get them out there to take a look at things and give you advice. If there's blackened tissue on plants, on trees especially, you can remove them with a high pressure hose to kind of give a little relief to them, but really judicious. Manage your water applications. If you're able to get water on them, maybe it's an oscillating sprinkler because it's possible your irrigation system has been melted. An oscillating sprinkler out there, or even hand watering. Making sure that there's plenty of gentle water being applied to the landscape and that there's a dry out in between the events, so you're not overwatering. Putting down compost. This is actually a really important thing very early on, getting a layer of compost down for a variety of reasons, but especially because sometimes soil that's dead becomes hydrophobic, and the compost can actually reduce hydrophobic conditions. As always, use your soil moisture probe to figure out what's going on below ground. Putting a nice, good wet wood chip mulch, 1.5 inches, no bigger, down to get moisture held in and keep the roots cool. Protecting the root zone from fire, from equipment running over it, and allowing the plants to really regenerate. Even things like palm trees will regenerate, from the center potentially. And don't be removing dead leaves from the tree itself. Let the plant do its own recovery. So with that, I am going to end the presentation. And there was one thing that I did not mention, regrettably so, and that is, but I do want to mention it, and that is that if you have a property that has a pool, or you work with a property that has a pool, please recommend to the property owners that they purchase uh, a pump, a mobile pump that they can put out near the pool for firefighters to be able to connect to that pump, a generator operated pump, that they can connect to that pump to use the pool water in their firefighting work. So that is it's like a couple $100 add-on, and it's worth it. All right. Were there any questions? I didn't see any questions.
There were questions, and of course now they're all flooding in. No
That's
worries.
right.
We've
Let's
got
do it.
about 15 minutes. So one of the questions that came up kind of in different ways, and you talked about it, but it is such an important question. They would love to hear your thoughts or expand your thoughts on balancing that, reducing the fuel load versus planting for erosion control, especially when you're up in the mountains. Um, and that
Yeah,
creating walls for fire breaks can be cost prohibitive on a large scale. I explained they don't have to be walls that create the same thing, but definitely that, how do we find that balance between the soil and diversity and lots of plants with this concern about fuel load?
good question.
Isn't it? It's
I
a
mean, I
tough.
don't think there's any answer, there really is an answer. The biggest answer is a lot more education in the fire community. I mean, I think personally, I'd love to know who's working with like insurance companies to really educate them on how landscaping works, um, and the value of healthy soil, not just plants. Because a lot of the dialogue around firescaping, at least in my experience, of 20 years or so, has been around, well, plant this plant, not that plant. Uh, you know, only natives, not natives, only lawn, not lawn. I mean, and it actually doesn't, it's as though plants have some like kind of magical qualities to them. I mean, plants do have magical qualities to them, but fire fighting is not one of them. It comes down to the environment in which they are growing. And a lot of the behaviors of plants are determined by the conditions on the site. So if you're not growing healthy soil sponge, you don't get um, you know, hydrated plants. You don't get plants that can reduce their water requirement. You don't get behaviors out of the plants if they're not living in ecosystems and in those conditions. So it really comes down to this balance of, so making sure, for example, that plants are planted at their proper distances and that you're not having fire ladders. So you can have a ground cover. Why can't you have a ground cover that's 8 inches tall, 10 inches tall even? But then your shrubs need to be managed so that they are above that, so that they don't connect to each other. And then your trees need to be limbed up so that they do not connect to each other. Doesn't mean there can't be ground cover around trees. Doesn't mean there can't be ground cover around shrubs or shrubs under trees. Just means we need to be thinking about managing that interconnectivity and that fuel spacing. So it's a lot more management, right? And the easy thing is just cut it all down. And that's what we need to educate about. So I don't know if that really, I mean, I'm just throwing into it because I don't think there's no hard and fast. And I think everybody should read these reports that are coming out and keep on top of reports that are coming out from the fires recently. And when I say recently, I mean like in the last 10 years, even last 5 years, where there have been many more fires in these, dense suburban urban landscapes that have, kind of come from a little bit more outside of the communities into the hearts of communities. There's a lot of rethinking about things. There are images that I've seen recently that I really need to read the reports, and I encourage you to do it too. But there are images I've seen recently where green hedges coming right up to structures, with only like a few inches gap, like a 6-inch or a 10-inch gap between the green hedge and the structure. And, they created fire breaks and the structures didn't burn. The hedges on the side where the wind was, bringing the heat from, or the radiant heat, from the neighbor's property, yeah, they burned on that side. But because the hedges were hydrated and it was a green living plant material, it didn't connect right up to the structure. It cooled it and stopped the fire. So, I mean, that's totally different from
Yeah.
what we
can
think about.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. So here's another question that came up again in a couple of different ways. And that was, what do you do when, especially in an urban setting where we're right up against each other? And so the question was, oftentimes between homes, there's only 10 feet. So is there really an opportunity for a safe zone? And if so, what does that look like? And you want your privacy, right? Everybody wants like the hedge in front of the window so they can't see their neighbor. Yeah.
It's not easy. Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, it's hard conversations.
Mhm.
The building to property lines is probably one of the worst things that we've ever done.
Right.
The permitting the building to property lines, from all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is there's no outdoor space anymore for people. But yeah, these are all, and you have to have a conversation with your neighbor. If you live cheek to jowl with your neighbor, you got to find a way to have dialogue with your neighbor, because your life will depend on it, may depend on it, and their lives may depend on it. And so whatever your differences or issues with their, boat that they've they've parked in their driveway, you need to have a dialogue. And it's thinking more about fencing materials that are, not combustible. It's thinking about placement of windows.
Yeah.
I don't have good answers for this. I mean, what did the community say? Did people
No,
answer?
they came out more as questions.
Yeah, I mean, there are no good answers. It's a horrible situation for us to be in. It is a horrible situation, and it has happened because we prioritize this build, I think, because we build the property lines. And of course, with the density of structures within a property, now you can have your ADU, you can have your, your mom shed, your man cave, they're like all, your yoga retreat, all on, a 5,000 square foot lot. And there's a lot of reason why that density is important for communal living. And, there are a lot of benefits to that. And at the same time, it makes it more dangerous for fire.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we have time for a couple more questions.
Sure.
Because of this mulch controversy, there was one slide that you showed where it was the big mound of it, and you had said above ground 600 degrees, below ground 200 degrees. Wondering if you could just explain what that meant when a fire comes through.
Yeah. So the thing about, so when we think about burning, it's not just burning up, right? It's burning down also, and smoldering, and burning down into the the root zone, but especially from a smoldering point of view. And if it stays hot, it can ignite again. And so there are actually some resources that we have that we include with this talk, that are all these studies that are being done about different mulches and at what temperature do they combust above ground, at what temperature do they smolder, at what temperature, and then so what are the underground temperatures. And the example that I was giving is that even when there's a 600-degree like ambient temperature, right, the mulch has kept the below ground temperature in a zone that isn't going to combust. And so so there's a lot being done with it, and this is where my statement about the pine needles came up. So there's been research done on pine needles and what happens with them, and basically it's not so much about the fact that the top burns, which of course it does, because anything that's dry is going to have a fast burn through it, right? It's about whether it's burning to depth. And the problem with pine needles is they actually can be up to 15 years of non-decomposable material there. So there's a lot of depth that can continue to smolder and continue to burn. And so that's really what that was all about. It's just there's a lot of discussion about this. And another example is oak leaf mulch. Oak leaf mulch. That the top is dry, it's gonna burn. Yeah, it burns, but it keeps the soil moisture so high and so cool beneath it that it doesn't have any ongoing problems with it as a mulch. So yeah, if you want it to burn, you want it to burn off, and then that's it, right? Not keep going.
Okay, smoldering. Yeah, that
So
idea.
that's kind of what that was about. And you can read for yourself in these various mulch studies that are done and draw your own conclusions. The composted mulch versus the nuggets is also a conclusion that came to. So the more it's decomposing, the better it is, essentially. And green brown, I'm coming around to it. The green brown decomposes a lot faster than anything else. That's the fastest decomposing mulch that you can get. I would like to actually address the Wheeler question, because so in California and a lot of other Western states, there is a movement toward reducing a landscape into plant factors for particular plants, which is essentially an assessment of their water requirement in inches per year or inches per period of time, and a assessment of the irrigation efficiency of the irrigation system that's installed. And the combination of the two, the plant water requirement and the irrigation efficiency together, create essentially a way of describing a landscape as being either more water efficient or less water efficient. So if the plant material requires less water based on its plant factor, it's good. If it, if it's requires more water, it's bad. So here's the bottom line. It's, in my humble opinion, that reductive approach to landscaping is a false premise altogether. And the reason is, and yes, we have to comply, but there's no reason why we can't and so when we say comply, it means that when landscapes are being designed, certain size landscapes, certain conditions, they have to meet a standard of water efficiency based on plant factor and irrigation efficiency. And the there are two issues with that, but the one that I think we're getting at here is that plants do not exhibit those qualities alone. They are, when they're monoculture cultivated, they don't have the same water requirements than they have when they are polyculture cultivated. So the more plants in the ecosystem, the more species of plants in an ecosystem, the more families of plants in an ecosystem, the more the whole performs in a way that is adaptive to the climate. So in a place where water is needing to be conserved by the ecosystem, they will conserve it. In a place where something needs to be tolerated, like cold or heat or salt, they will tolerate it. They don't do it when they're in monoculture, but they do it when they're part of a dense ecosystem. So the whole MWELO requirement thing,
It's another conversation.
a whole other conversation, but that's it. So we need that for our landscaping. Okay.
So as we draw to a close, we thank you so much for joining us today. And if you're not joining us today for registering it, you will be getting a recording. All of you who registered, so if you wanted to watch it again, you absolutely can. And Watershed Wise training is an expanding business. We have taken classes from our G3. They are recorded and available on demand on Watershed Wise. Here is the link. We'll be sending that to you as well. And there are classes for professionals as well as homeowners. So if you have clients that you want to be able to guide, there are classes for them there as well. So is there anything
I
else?
wanted to add something to
Yes,
that.
please.
So it's great to take these classes after the fact and watch the videos and read through the resources that we provide and the chat and the Q&A, which is always interesting. It's wonderful after the fact, but there's nothing like being involved in the live class. I think that we want to even expand further the Q&A part. The Q&A is set up that you can comment on other people's questions. And so I highly recommend that in the future, you take these classes and come in prepared, to share resources and to also question what other people are asking and share your own experiences, because it's the only way that we can all learn is from each other.
All right. Well, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.